So this conference is about structural change and structural reforms. And there is a sense in which the green transformation, which is the subject of this session, is probably the most ambitious worldwide structural reform in the history of the world, just to motivate the session. But I think it's true. It's an incredibly complex endeavor, even compared to some of the other ones we've discussed already. We have to handle mitigation. We have to handle adaptation. We have to do this under tremendous uncertainty about both the nature of the threat and the speed at which it's coming, and about the efficacy of the tools that we may want to use. And we have to do it quick and big. And so that session clearly very much belongs to this conference. Now, it's clear, given the complexity of a task, that a holistic approach is needed. In general, I don't like the word holistic, but in this case, I think it works, in the sense that it really has to have many dimensions. And although I'm not a researcher in the field, I follow it fairly closely. And I would say we probably have to have a strategy which relies on 5 legs. So let me just go through the list. The first one, which is the one that any well-trained economist starts with, is carbon taxes or carbon fees, because this looks like the right Pigouvian answer to the issue. But the more you work on it, the more you realize I think it's a necessary tool, but it's far from sufficient given the dimension of the challenge. So the second one, which also is fairly standard among standard thinking economists, is subsidies to R&D. And the argument there doesn't have much to do with green, but just with the fact that R&D has externalities, and R&D is very often justified, and you can say that in the particular context, the externalities are even larger. So that's the second one. The third one, and we get to stuff which goes a bit outside the standard kind of Act 10 answer, is targeted subsidies to specific types of green investment. And I think the logic there is very much in the coordination issues which arise, for example, from supply chains, which is that you're going to change your technology along the supply chain only if the upstreamers or the downstreamers do it. And we tend to think that the price system is probably not the way to do it, probably just force somebody to do it and then get the chain to do it. It's probably better. The fourth one is public investment. And we all understand the example of chargers for EVs. And in practice, it really has to be done by the state. But there are many other examples of having to basically build the right infrastructure. And then the last one, which again I think would have been controversial a while back, but is less and less, is specific regulations. No more thermic cars after some date or something like this, because we understand the limits of using prices, and that's a way of organizing things in a way which makes sense. So for example, we have to reorganize cities, and I don't think we can do it entirely by the price system. We basically have to say cars can't go into the streets, and so on and so on. That's regulations. And so the mix of regulations and price incentives has to be basically the portfolio. I think that description shows the complexity of the task, and that's what I think we should be discussing. Now, in that context, I had prepared, I think, 5 questions for the panelists. I don't expect them to answer all of them, but I think these are the questions that we should have in mind. The first question is, do I have the right description of the portfolio? For example, how essential are carbon taxes in the mix, or have I missed something? The second one, which gets to the political issues, which is how far are we from the optimal portfolio given the political constraints that governments are facing? The example being, in the recent past, in my part of the world, the farmers' reaction to a number of green measures. And can we do a better job selling the need to do it? So there's work by Stefanie Stancheva at Harvard, which is extremely interesting in that respect. The third issue, which, and I made this remark yesterday when somebody mentioned French planning, is that we have to do this under conditions of extreme uncertainty about what's happening. Are there really no nonlinear processes at work? And the casual looking suggests, yes, there are nonlinearities, and then the effect of the measures that we take. And so how do you basically organize institutionally the fight in an environment in which the enemy is not well defined and is changing all the time? And I think that's, again, a real issue. The fourth is, should we worry about differences of strategies between countries? And my own answer is yes. I'm absolutely struck by the difference between the US and Europe, more or less subsidies on one side, taxes or fees on the other. That's going to create enormous tensions of competitiveness, of commercial wars. Can we avoid it? And then the fifth issue, which is, I think, the one closest to, I think, Nick Stern's heart at this point, is it's just not the advanced countries. Most of the effort has to come from the other part of the world. And they don't have the means. And so the question is, can we succeed? What do we need to do in order to succeed together? So 5 really simple questions, 12 minutes per speaker, and we'll be done. Let me just say just a few words about the speakers. I mean, they are a tremendous set. So the first one, I think I'll go in the order of presentation. Where's Kim? Kimberly Clausing. She's the Eric Zolt Chair in Tax Law and Policy at UCLA Law School. But before that, Kim was at Treasury in the Biden administration and has worked very much on fiscal issues, but in particular on the fiscal issues associated with green transformation. She's, and I'm happy to say, a non-resident fellow of the Peterson. We're happy to have her. The second one is Jean Pisani-Ferry, who is also a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson, and was the founder and is a senior fellow of Bruegel in Europe, which is a very influential think tank. I think the best description is both an academic and very involved in policy. He was the director of the program for programs and ideas of the first Macron run for presidency, the one that Macron indeed won. And more recently, he has done a report with Salman Mahfouz for the Prime Minister on the economics of green transformation. So he's really ideal for that intervention. And then the last one is Nick Stern. Nick is the I.J. Patel Professor of Economics and Government at LSE. He also leads a center, but it was too long to actually spell, so but he does a number of things. No need to talk about his career, which is very distinguished, both from the academic front and the policy front. I was going to say you started focusing on it in the Stern Review in 2006, but might be wrong. You might have started long earlier. But at least in 2006, he produced the Stern Review, which on global warming, climate change, which made a big difference. And then since then, he has been at the forefront of nearly all the discussions of a green transformation. So we're very lucky to have him. Each of you 12 minutes, and then we'll see where we go. Kim?
Thank you so much, Olivier and Maury and all the organizers of this conference for bringing us together to talk about so many important issues. In my remarks, I'm going to focus on a subset of Olivier's questions, in particular, how we think about the portfolio of policy options, both in an ideal sense, but also in a practical political economy-infused sense, but also how we think about international policy spillovers, recognizing that we will not be successful in the green transformation unless we bring the whole world along. And so the most important North Star of this conversation is how does policy affect global emissions reductions? So I'm going to look at these questions through a tax policy lens for two reasons, a good one and a not great one. The not great one is in the US context, we often do climate policy through the tax code for bizarre Senate rule reasons. But if you look at tax policy criteria, the good reason to look at those criteria is that they're very relevant in the climate policy space. When we're trying to evaluate a policy, we ask some of the same questions. How much does it cost? Does it raise revenue for the government, or does it cost the government money? That's a very salient question in almost any country. The distributional one is very important. Who pays for this policy? And is it a regressive or progressive policy? In the climate space, of course, the efficiency one is most important. How do we respond to the existential threat that is climate change? How do we do that most effectively, since there are so many important externalities in this space? And not just domestically, in terms of responding to externalities here, but also how do our policies affect policies in other countries? And then finally, administration and compliance, while not as sexy as the other criteria, often determine whether the policy works at all. And so bearing that in mind is important as well. Of course, countries pursue different approaches. This is a graph actually from before the Inflation Reduction Act that shows that already the United States was spending more on clean energy in absolute terms than most countries. That's one way of responding, is spending money. Another way is charging or imposing a carbon price. And this is a diagram that sort of shows many of the jurisdictions that use carbon pricing. With the price on the vertical axis, you see that there's quite a bit of variation in the price used, but according to the World Bank, about 23% of global emissions are covered by a carbon price. So when thinking about fiscal impacts, clearly a carbon price has the potential to raise a lot of money, whereas spending money uses fiscal resources. These fiscal questions, I think, are quite salient. And even in the United States, where we've really lately thrown a lot of money at this problem, I think fiscal considerations are going to be very salient coming down the road in 2025 for a couple of reasons. But I think the most central of which is that we already have very large deficits and debts projected to grow steadily over the coming decades. Yet in 2025, tax cuts that to fully extend them would cost over $4 trillion. They're scheduled to expire. Congress very much wants to keep them, but that would be a very bad look given how much that would increase the deficits. So this is going to mean, if you're a Republican, one place to get money is to cut IRA subsidies. But also, I think it's an opportunity to think about carbon pricing as a solution that can help stem the fiscal gap. Obviously, this is not a US issue alone. Every country is facing these important fiscal constraints. And in this context, I think thinking about policy design is also very important to get to Olivier's point here in terms of the policy portfolio. One interesting question on the carbon fee front is, do you design it on a consumption or a production basis? A recent work, we found that now that the US is scheduled to be ever more fossil fuel exporter, you'd actually get about twice as much money from the carbon fee if you did it on a production basis rather than a consumption basis, which is kind of interesting. But also, how do you address the political economy? And there's opportunity to earmark the revenue, as Stancheva's research has suggested, that might improve that. Turning to distributional impacts, I would point out that every policy, tax, subsidy, regulation, has a distributional impact. So for instance, the IRA subsidies, people were often like, well, you have to do that because carbon pricing is regressive, so of course this isn't, but it is. It's very much just as regressive. If you look at the Tax Policy Center analysis of repealing the IRA subsidies, it would disproportionately be a tax increase at the top because you're really channeling those subsidies disproportionately to those at the top. The point isn't that we shouldn't do climate policy because it has potentially negative distributional impacts. The point is that if you do it in the context of larger tax policy reform, you can more than undo these distributional impacts if you find them to be adverse through other tax policy tools. So, in the United States in 2025, we'll have a natural opportunity to do this, but in other countries as well, not only is there a diversity of distributional impacts. Like in some of the poorer countries, carbon pricing might even be progressive, but there are always tools to undo those. Administrative and compliance issues are extremely important. I'm not going to go into them because of time, but they can often make the difference in terms of success or failure. I am going to spend more time on efficiency. And efficiency here, I'm thinking about the ability to internalize the negative externalities associated with greenhouse gas emissions. And some recent work that I did with a team that includes John Bisling, Catherine Wolfram, Jim Stock, and Neil Mahorta, we look at 7 possible policy scenarios for the United States going forward. And the 3 that I'm showing in this diagram are the red line, which shows emissions reductions sort of in the counterfactual where there hadn't been a Biden administration. There was no Inflation Reduction Act. There was no revisions to the EPA regulations. That's what would have happened. We're right now on the blue dash line. That is our forecast in these EPRI energy modeling of what will happen to U.S. emissions reductions. We don't meet the Paris commitment, but we get closer than we would have without those 2 policy tools. The green dotted line shows you the impact of a very modest carbon fee, and by very modest, it's very modest in a couple of ways. It doesn't even start for a couple of years. It starts at $15. It slowly rises to $65, and it completely carves out retail gasoline. Why? Not because that's the right thing to do, but rather because that's the sort of politically imaginable version of like what we might be able to get in the United States. That version alone raises $600 billion over 10 years. If you do it on a production basis, twice that much. And makes a serious dent in emissions, right? And carbon pricing is just such an effective tool here. What's interesting is if you look as well at household energy expenditures in those 3 different scenarios with very different emissions lines, they're only $200 apart, right? Out of a $3,000 that a typical American household is spending on energy in a year. So I think these distributional effects are quite small compared to the emissions effects. So I think finding a political economy way around them is really crucial. Most important, really, in thinking about US policy adoption or any country's policy adoption is how they work together, right? I think one thing that we've all seen looking at the world around us is that countries are falling far short of what's required to address this huge global collective action problem. Trade and finance are really important sticks and carrots that we can use to induce more incentives and make more effective global cooperation. But the trade and finance carrots and sticks will work best if they're done in an aligned and cooperative fashion and not in a misaligned and random fashion. So I think it's extremely important that we work to get policies more aligned and cooperative here, but in the meantime, we also need to handle the frictions that arise when countries aren't pursuing aligned policies. In that context, for instance, look at the US Inflation Reduction Act that has policy spillovers that are both positive and negative. The administration, of course, would emphasize the positive ones, right? We are reducing emissions in the United States. That should help solve the global problem. There will be learning that occurs when you subsidize things like clean hydrogen and carbon capture, direct air capture. That's fabulous. So those are all good things. But there are, of course, negative things too, not just the national content rules, which show sort of disregard for World Trade Organization norms, but also these spillovers of competitiveness that I think are very salient in countries that are attempting to impose costs on their firms. Take Canada, our northern neighbor, take the EU, take the UK, right? They are all attempting to impose costs on their firms. So when they see the US subsidizing their firms and they're imposing costs, you get to situations like the Green Steel deal that was supposed to be a deal, but was actually just like a green steel disagreement, where the US government sort of asserted that what really matters is this vertical dimension here. Are you a high ambition or a low ambition country? If you're high ambition, you should be able to put tariffs on low ambition, voila. But the Europeans were like, hold on a minute, what matters is this other dimension. You are handing money to your firms, we are charging them. We should not have the same tariff. And if the Europeans are correct about this, but what's interesting is that that tariff policy, whatever it is, there's no way to handle both of these types of policy spillovers with one instrument, right? Because unless people choose aligned policy tools, right, any one instrument will fall short in one of these dimensions. So I think the hope is to get countries more aligned. If countries were more aligned on the pricing instrument, right, then I think it's a much easier way to move towards global collective action solutions. And so this is sort of my optimistic last slide here. Let's say countries did align. Let's say there were a group that included, of course, the EU, UK, and Canada that are already going down this road and thinking about carbon border adjustments. But let's imagine a scenario where the US is able to join that in 2025. Right now, if you're another country and you want to access any of those markets and they've got a uniform approach, right, you've got a really strong incentive to consider carbon pricing yourself. And Catherine Wolfram and I have been tracking countries' announcements with respect to the EU CBAM, and we've found more than a dozen, I think it's approaching 20 now, of countries that have cited the EU CBAM as a reason to contemplate carbon pricing, right? Make that an even bigger group, there's an even bigger incentive, and the logic isn't always completely airtight for this incentive, but it's something like, well, we'd rather, collect the revenue ourselves than hand it to Europe, of course. Or maybe it's something that you could almost justify doing politically, but now you get to blame someone else. But those are important political economy motivations that can kind of move the world towards pricing. And I think it's a very important moment to try to seize greater alignment and pursue that. Two cautions that I will end with, even though it's saying that this is optimism. I think it's very important that you actually have a price to adjust to if you're going to join this club. There are some, including some members of Congress, that say, okay, well, the tariff part sounds great, let's do that, but why would we impose costs on our firms? And I think that that's very dangerous, in part because you might actually be increasing world emissions with such a policy because you're undermining non-discriminatory approaches in places like Europe and Canada and the UK, right? And so I think undermining good efforts abroad, it shouldn't be the approach. A second issue, and then I think this one is particularly important, is how do you handle the differentiated responsibility of poor countries? And I think there are three important steps that one could take here. The first is, I think, for the poorest countries of the world, you can easily exempt them from the regime. And the poorest set is only 4% of world emissions. Until they're richer, I think it would be perfectly justified to exempt them. I also think a tiered carbon pricing minimum required to turn off a CBAM is something that people should consider as a friendly amendment to the non-discriminatory approach. But again, done collaboratively, this is easier to negotiate. But imagine, like, if you're a somewhat poor country, the tier is $25, then $50 if you're in the middle, and then $75 if you're rich. Right, and the IMF has a nice proposal, which is where I got those tier numbers from, that would do that. And if you turned off the CBAMs at different prices, while it would violate certain norms, I think in a coordinated, negotiated way, it might actually kind of bring more people to the table around this issue. And the final thing that would be useful is to pair all of this cooperation with more climate finance, to have the carrot as well as the stick. So to bring people to the table to negotiate these tiers, and then also say, while you're at the table, you get these sets of benefits in terms of finance. So I think that that would be a very useful way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm waiting for my slides. That gives me the opportunity to really, congratulate Maury and Pierre-Olivier for having organized this conference, which I think is very timely and on a very essential topic. What I'm going to do is essentially to illustrate this fact that the green transformation, and that very much in line with what Olivier started with, is really a sort of policy-induced transformation. So it's a case study in steering a major transformation, and I agree with you, it's probably the most important transformation in history, and steering it with the right policy instruments. So it's not going to happen spontaneously because we know, I mean, all the externalities there prevent it from happening spontaneously. So it has to be triggered, and the whole question is with what type of instruments. Now, oops. Yeah. Just to illustrate the magnitude of the transformation, this is the world energy supply. So you have, in green, you have the traditional biomass, then you have coal, then the oil and gas. And you see that over time, the substitution took place, and that the new sources of energy replaced the old sources of energy. Now, I used the IEA projection for net zero just to complement this graph and check what the magnitude of the transformation ahead of us. And it's absolutely major. Basically, you know, in energy became dominant moved from marginal to dominant when it got from less than 10% of the global energy supply to more than 50%. And it typically took 50 to 60 years. This time it's going to be much more because it's not going to be 50% or 60%. It's going to be the whole system that needs to be carbon neutral. And it's going to be a much shorter period. So that's the magnitude of what is ahead of us. Now, it's a special kind of structural change, and let me sort of go through some of the characteristics of this transformation. It will require massive investment, and I'm going to go back to that. It will be most probably detrimental to growth temporarily, probably not in the long term, but temporarily I think we have to recognize that it may have a negative effect on growth. It will be costly for public finances, and therefore the whole question of how to finance this transformation comes to the fore, and I'm going to come back to that. The mechanisms behind this transformation, I think, can be simplified and can be summarized in three types of transformation. One is the change in lifestyle. So basically, if you're taking your bike, if you're eating less red meat, etc., that's a change in lifestyle. It can be mechanisms are a bit subtle because it's in part it's nudge, in part it's regulation, in part it's public investment. You don't take your bike if there are no bike lanes, or you're taking risks. But that's one of the dimensions. The change in lifestyle is an important dimension. It's also an important dimension because it makes people individually actors of this transformation instead of being just those who have to accept what's happening. Second is a redirection of technical progress. So all what leads to transforming the type of technologies that drive the transformation. And the third, and in my view the most important one, at least in the short term, is the substitution of capital for fossil fuels. And the reason being that, any type of transformation we can think of is much more capital intensive. So you have to put up more capital upfront, and you get savings down the road in terms of lower operational expenditure. So that's true for renewable electricity, that's true for electric vehicles, that's true for heat pumps and building insulation. So it's a very generic system. So just to illustrate the first point, so the change in lifestyle and change in behavior, that the French electricity consumption on a weekly basis and the way it has been affected by the war in Ukraine. And what you're seeing here is that So the yellow curve is just the average the average consumption over the 5 years before the war, and the reaction to the war has been to reduce the consumption of electricity, and it has been persistent. So it's an indication that you can have changes in behavior. Now, the redirection of technical progress is taking place. It's taking place, interestingly, you see that in the distribution of patents or R&D spending. And so you're seeing more R&D spending in low carbon technologies, that's the blue bars, for the private sector. Public, it's orange bars. And so that's taking place, and it is delivering. And I think it's important to see the extent to which those transformations are delivering benefits, because those benefits, that's from the International Energy Agency. So every 2 years, it's just revise their forecast for 2030. And each time, each vintage, you had a higher, the dot moved from, very low, for example, uptake of wind, so less than 5%, to 15%. And each time, it's been consistent across time, over time, and across technologies. So it's really delivering in this regard. Now, what I mentioned in terms of the generic mechanism is this mechanism that's illustrated by this graph, which is taken from the Climate Change Committee in the UK, which puts above the line the investment into green technologies, and below the line, the effect in terms of reduction in OPEX. So that's, in my view, that's a very clear graph, because it shows that you've got to invest early on, you've got to pay price, and down the road there's a benefit that's associated with that. But does not come immediately. I mean, those numbers, they are roughly 2% of GDP in the UK case, so which is roughly what you find for many advanced countries. And below the line, you have the gains, which eventually become larger than the capex, but only eventually. So, where do we stand with this investment? This investment that's a survey that's done by an Institute for Climate Economics, which sort of tries to track investment in the EU and compare this investment to what's needed to reach net zero. And basically, we are sort of halfway. So we are 400 billion euros in 22. We've got to reach 800 billion. So we're still not there, but we're some way in this direction. So the question, and let me conclude with that, is that there needs to be policy levels. And that's a question that was raised by Olivier about, how to combine, and Kim also, how to combine the different policy levels. We're not in a first best world in which, you could do everything through pricing. You've got to combine instruments that affect behavior through, nudge and through changing the social norms, and in some cases hard regulation, like for the prohibition of fossil fuel powered cars. And then you have to also use subsidies for technical progress, for redirecting technical progress, and subsidies also together with carbon pricing for the triggering the capital fossil fuel substitution. So why do we need multiple instruments? In large part for political economy reasons, because if you were to act exclusively through prices, that would imply a much too high level of prices. But not only, in some cases, you know, I mean, the change in lifestyle that doesn't come from carbon prices, it comes from, you know, convincing people that there are different lifestyles. And so the case for a hybrid strategy, and I think that's very much the topic of this panel, is that how to combine these different instruments. And let me just make one point that, you know, if you have only one instrument, you don't make mistakes. I mean, you can set your instrument at the wrong level, but the question of how do you combine your different instruments doesn't arise in a one instrument setting. So in a multiple instrument setting, you have to adapt it to the situation. And that's the difficulty. Let me end on one thing, which is the fiscal cost. So the fiscal cost, it comes from public investment, you know, everything that is a public responsibility, and that in France, for example, you know, schools are public responsibility, so the retrofitting of schools is a public responsibility. It's a burden on the taxpayers' money, but also it comes from the fact that you're asking households to make investments, and if you compute what the cost of those investments, you see that they exceed even what is affordable for middle-class households. You know, for median income, you're speaking of an investment that represents a year of income, both for retrofitting houses and for changing the vehicle. So that's very costly, and that's not going to happen if they are not supported, if they are not subsidized. And the cost, will sort of end up on the public budget. Let me skip that because it's in the interest of time. The question is, can it be financed by debt? And I think the notion that debt is part of the answer has to be recognized in principle and in practice. In principle, the reason is that, you know, the urgent action should not be constrained by the scarcity of public funds. It's that temporary excess public spending does not put the sustainability of public finances in jeopardy, provided it's really temporary. And so that's equity and political economy consideration call for spreading the cost of action over time. Now, the EU fiscal rules do not make it possible. And that's a major problem we're facing. The EU fiscal rule leave a very narrow window for investment in climate. And that's a discussion we sort of, you know, we're supposed to have. And in fact, the decision taken was to leave very little room for financing through that, which I think is a mistake, and which I think is going to come back, you know, in the discussion, one way or another. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier, everybody here at the Peterson Institute for this occasion and for asking me along. What I have to say is largely complementary to what Kim and Jean were saying. So the fact that I don't repeat what they say should not be taken as disagreement in any way. I'm probably a bit more optimistic about growth than Jean, but I'll give some of the arguments and you can make up your mind. I also think the point raised at the end on debt is extremely important. We ran up big debt around COVID, and we were right to do so. This is not, you know, this is something which has very powerful long-term returns, and it's in response to a crisis which is bigger than COVID, so it seems to me perfectly reasonable. But let me move quickly because I want to focus on emerging markets and developing economies outside China. Emerging markets and economies outside China, probably around 5.3 billion people. Add in China, that's 1.4 billion on top of that. These are the places where growth is likely to be concentrated in the next 20 or 30 years, and if it's growth along past patterns, then we are in deep, deep trouble. So the rich countries matter enormously in what they do. They matter enormously in the kinds of finance they can bring to the table. But the bigger part of the answer is going to be in emerging markets and developing economies outside China, and a very big part of the answer is China itself. Joe Stiglitz and I and others have been working away with Chinese collaborators on trying to influence the 15th five-year plan, which is 2025 to 2030. That will be the biggest single most important policy event in the climate space. I'll make that remark. I won't say very much about China again, but again, that's something perhaps in the discussion we can come back to. So that's where I'll focus. Just to give an example of the extent to which the action is there, 80% of India's infrastructure likely to exist in 2050 will be built between now and then. It's how that is shaped that's going to be so important. For Africa, that 80% would be still higher, what is to be built. And of course, infrastructure, a very big part of this whole set of issues. So as Olivier set out, and I fully agree at the beginning, this is fundamental systemic change. And we have to think through how that can be pursued in real time. And it's a huge problem. It's outside the kind of modeling that we're used to. And we're going to have to think through how best to bring analytical perspectives to the table, which really inform that, bearing in mind that we're going to have to make lots of guesses and there are bound to be mistakes along the way. But the difficulties and the uncertainties of following this path are things that have to be faced. The worst possible thing is not to face them and not to do very much, and that is the most risky outcome of all. So everything we do here is going to be risky, but I think doing nothing is something that is, or very little or very slowly, is not something that we should contemplate. That's the biggest risk. So the big systems, energy, transport, cities, land, and water, all countries, there are not going to be huge amounts of negatives, so getting to net zero by 2050 means you have to be net zero more or less everywhere. We have to invest a lot, and Jean already emphasized that, probably an increase in investment of about, on a flow basis, about $4 trillion a year, different kinds of estimates by 2030, but then more or less in the same kind of ballpark. I'm going to respond to to Olivier's question about the portfolio of projects by looking at the portfolio of market failures that we face. I think I might end up responding to about 4 out of the 5, Olivier, but perhaps not all of them. These MDBs are absolutely central in all this because the cost of capital, for the reasons Jean emphasized, is absolutely center stage. The just transition is something that lives are dislocated as a result of fundamental change. It would be immoral not to take that into account, and of course it would be that inability to take it into account or refusal to take it into account would erect very severe obstacles to change. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on just transition. We've got some models, we've got some past practice in the UK which shows how not to do it. When we shut down the coal mines in the 1980s, we devastated whole communities for a very long period. You have to invest in people and places. It's not just changes in relative prices. Of course that matters. That does have distribution effects. But I think the bigger part of the story is the dislocation. That, of course, runs across many areas. So in this story, I've emphasized emerging markets and developing economies. We've seen there's been quite a lot of progress, and there has been quite a lot of progress in green investment. But 95% of the clean investment in the last 3 years or so has been in the rich countries and in China, 95%. And of the remaining 5%, most of it's been in India and Brazil. So that's an illustration of the magnitude of the task that I'm trying to discuss here. The action there is, why has that action been so low? I haven't got time to go in any detail, but I've sketched it out here. There's been a lot of discussion about a horse race between growth on the one hand and growth and development on the one hand, climate action on the other. I'll touch on that. There's an undervaluing of future generations and the co-benefits, particularly the health benefits, but particularly important is the cost of capital. As Jean's diagram showed very clearly, the cost of capital is going to be critical in determining the profitability of investments here. Solar and wind are cheaper in Africa at 6, 7, 8% cost of capital, not at the 20, 25% that they face. So that is absolutely center stage, and why many of us have emphasized the MDBs so much and their ability, or lack of it so far, but improving their ability to collaborate with the private sector to share the risks, manage the risks, and bring down the cost of capital. Issues around dislocation, pushback from vested interests, and particularly in the developing world, a mistrust, an understandable mistrust of promises from the rich world. All reasons why we've been going so slowly. Turning now to more positive parts of the story and being a bit more optimistic, I think of the growth story as having 6 elements. The first is very powerful lowering of costs by learning by doing and induced innovation, big economies of scale in many areas. In India, they absolutely crashed the cost of light bulbs, of efficient LED light bulbs by going to scale and mass purchase. So innovation, returns to scale, big potential in resource efficiency, including, of course, insulating homes, but right across the board. Efficiency is productivity, is growth. Huge issues in systems. Cities where you can move and breathe are likely to be cities which are much more productive than cities where you cannot. Capturing those potential efficiency gains or potential productivity gains is not hard to do, but there are some, is hard to do, but there's some attempts of that. Improved health. In the UK, we kill 35,000 a year from air pollution, and not all fossil fuel burning, but much of it. We kill 1,500 or so from road accidents, well over 20 times killed through air pollution. Those are big co-benefits. And you can try to evaluate them in various ways through illness, cost values of life, and so on. But you get big numbers, 5, 6, 7% of GDP, depending where you look. So for these reasons, they're very powerful growth effects. Those are not normally, those effects, very well captured in our current models. The last one, the increase in the share of investment, which does have a growth effect, is in standard models. Of course, these are nuanced because of the way in which this investment works. Again, Jean illustrated, I won't go over it again. But this is a growth story if we can get it right. It does mean investing a lot up front, and of course some of the investment up front will go with reduced consumption up front. But we're better off because they're good investments. Yeah? So we shouldn't interpret a drop in consumption as a drop in welfare. It's actually through those investments there's a really big increase in welfare. And just to remind you that there's no high carbon growth story. It self-destructs pretty quickly. So this is a little bit on tipping points and non-linearities, Olivier, here. These are diagrams prepared by my colleagues in systemic. And the green is where the clean is cheaper than the dirty. And this is without carbon pricing or without subsidies. So you can see that already the clean is cheaper than the dirty for much of electricity. It does depend on the cost of capital, of course, but that's true up to 7 or 8% for cost of capital. Road cars, the electric vehicles, essentially already over their lifetime cheaper than the all alternatives, and of course the upfront cost dropping very quickly. Aviation and steel and so on are a bit further away, but roughly speaking, probably about 30% of emissions are in areas where the clean is already cheaper than the dirty. And in 10 years' time, that 1/3 of emissions could well be 2/3 of emissions are areas where the clean is cheaper than the dirty, without carbon price, without subsidy. You have to invest to get there. We keep having to remind ourselves it doesn't happen by magic, but the change in technology is remarkable relative to what many of us were thinking just 15 or 20 years ago. Again, Jean illustrated that through the forecasts of the International Energy Agency and so on. Now, this is Olivier on the portfolio. I mean, I've come at that question through the market failures that you're trying to tackle. The first two, of course, that Jean mentioned, absolutely right. But if you can think of those as at the sort of outside ends, the greenhouse gas price is at the end of the consumer and what they face, and the R&D is at the end of what opportunities available to producers. But there's so much action in the middle. Those are just sort of the two ends to the process, and the way the capital markets work, of course, extremely important. So much of this is networks, whether it's public transport or electricity grids or internet connections or recycling and reusing. Big issues around information, and of course that last one, which has the slightly flat title of co-benefits, I would include the huge health benefits in that. So those are all market failures, and we can think, and at the very right-hand side, I won't go through it in detail, on the right-hand side I've got the policy options for tackling that. But let me emphasize one really important point here. This is hugely about investment, whether you follow Keynes or von Hayek. I think you should follow both, actually. Expectations are absolutely at center stage. The worst thing governments can do is just muck about, stop and chop and change, and that really undermines the whole investment process and pushes up the cost of capital. This is my last slide, which is about finance. What I want to do is just, the whole story of climate finance is nested within the Sustainable Development Goals. The left-hand side of this diagram is the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to concentrate on the right-hand side. The climate finance is essentially here, we're defining it as the energy transition, adaptation and resilience and loss and damage, and natural capital. That's what we, for these calculations, we use as climate finance, but it's nested within the whole story of sustainable growth. It's part of that story. Looking at emerging markets and developing countries and asking about the kinds of investments under those headings that I just gave you would be necessary as flows in 2030, we come to $2.4 trillion as a flow. Of course, it's the whole path that matters, but I'm just picking on 2030 as an illustrative of a point along that path. This is the total amount of investment, not the increment, it's the total amount of investment in these areas that needs financing. But it is probably order of magnitude 6 times the current investment. Or is that 1 minute left? Yeah. So what we argued here is that if you look at that 2.4 trillion, look at the potential for domestic resource mobilization, extremely important, of course, in all this. It means you need an external financing flow of about $1 trillion. A bit over half of that could be from the private sector, but that won't come unless they've got somebody to hold their hand and share the risk and bring down the cost of capital. Hence the conclusion that we came to in the G20 report we prepared at the request of the Indian presidency and Indian finance minister, co-chaired by M.K. Singh, Larry Summers. I was part of that. We recommended a tripling of the flows from the multilateral development banks. It's actually very cheap to do. It would require better use of existing capital. It would require some extra use of hybrid capital and guarantees, and it would require a capital increase of about $8 billion. This is all the MDBs, $8 billion a year over 10 years. $8 billion a year over 10 years. I mean, that's peanuts in this grand order of things. You know, the UK share of that might be, 400 million a year. So that, I mean, this is the kind of thing that's close to rounding error. It doesn't mean, of course, that the political willingness to do that is is already up the flagpole. It's not there. But it's very important that we understand how easily, really, it would be to equip the MDBs with the firepower that they need. They then, of course, have to perform in a way that really does bring down the cost of capital across the board and does allow the private sector to come in. There'll be some parts of the story which will need highly concessional capital or zero-cost capital. For example, investing in people and places to manage the transition as I've described, or investing in natural capital. Some of that will have to be zero-cost capital. So you'll need a blend for the job. It'll be different for different parts of the story. But this is perfectly feasible, and it's difficult. But there's a distinction between impossible and difficult. And just throwing up your hands at the difficulty is the worst possible way forward. Thank you.
You can hear me? Yeah. Okay. No, I'm amazed at how much we learned in the span of an hour. Thank you so much to all of you. I thought some of the figures were absolutely striking. And we actually covered some of the answers to my questions, which I wasn't sure would happen. We have time for a few questions. Warwick, you start.
Is it working now? Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Warwick McKibben from the Australian National University in Peterson. Great presentations. I wanted to pick up on a point that Nick raised at the end, and the issue of requiring bipartisan support within countries to sustain the policies, to sustain the low cost of capital. And I wonder if any of the speakers had a comment on using economic instruments to build political constituencies within countries to maintain the bipartisan support. I mean, financial incentives is a great way to cross the political divide, and you didn't touch on the use of instruments for that, but I think that's a way forward, and I wonder if any of you had comments in that area.
We can answer one.
In the UK, the climate change legislation and the climate change, I need to turn it on, I guess. Oh, there's a little word that says push, and I pushed, yeah. The Climate Change Committee in the UK, it's part of the climate change legislation. And that, I think, has produced some stability. Jean offered some figures and graphs from work they had done. And that's an institutional example of the way in which you can pull people together and give longer-term time horizons. China does it through its 5-year plans and the longer-term targets that it sets. And huge investment takes place in these areas in China. And again, that's because they have a reasonably clear direction of where it's going. In terms of the magnitude, they're building well over 200 gigawatts of renewables a year. The total capacity in the UK is 80. So those are two examples of different ends of the spectrum, if you like, of the ways in which some kinds of institutional stability can deliver. On the whole, it helps if the need to change covers a big part of the political spectrum, and that's more true outside the United States than inside the United States.
Good. Let me take Please, Caroline.
Thanks very much. This is a kind of political economy question. We've just seen and heard the Treasury Secretary Yellen, great economist, has been to China and criticized their subsidies for electric vehicles. And that seems backwards if we want to encourage research and cheap plans. But maybe it goes to Kim's point about taxes versus subsidies. So I'd love to hear comments on that.
I mean, I think one of the positive things, many positive things to say about Secretary Yellen always, but I think one of the positive things about the China visit was the building of consensus that China and the United States both need to be doing important things on climate. And that was another one of the messages that came out of that. I do think that a subsidy approach shows a fundamental tension between productive action on the climate and sort of beggar thy neighbor industrial policy that isn't going to go away if that's your lone instrument, right? So I think the more countries can use the fiscal moment to pivot towards an aligned approach, the better. But in the meantime, I think the WTO and other fora should work to sort of smooth some of these frictions, because I think just everybody kind of crossing their arms and tariffing each other in response would be a very harmful outcome. So I have a different paper with Chad Bound that we did about a year ago suggesting some WTO steps.
Could I just add that one of the reasons that the costs in China have been falling so much is scale and competition. You expect big markets, and my goodness, they compete like mad. It's cutthroat.
But this is, I think, the first installment of many episodes in which, whether it's industrial policy or commercial war, is going to come up. And this is just the start. It's fundamental. I had Ricardo.
Fascinating panel. Thank you very much. We notice that, I mean, the cost of capital is central to pricing of everything. But then I wonder to what extent all the solutions are very partial equilibrium in flavor and saying, well, if I had this deus ex machina here and I subsidized a little bit of capital through MDBs, then we're home free. But first question is, what we would endogenize a little bit that cost of capital. Why is it so high? What happens to the cost of capital of the things that are not being subsidized? What is the debt to GDP ratio of countries in the developing world after they have gone through climate finance? How sustainable would that level be? What is the implications for capital allocation and things that are not being subsidized? So I was just wondering how much work there has been in a more general equilibrium of understanding of what is involved in climate finance.
I think the general equilibrium work in looking at how the structure of sectors changes, how the cost of capital changes across sectors, has been pretty minimal. And I certainly take the counsel that it's the kind of thing that we should be doing. But what this illustrates for me is that we're going to need a whole set of policy perspectives and analyses. You're going to look at how cities change. You're going to look at how land systems change, energy systems change, how innovation and discovery work, how economies of scale kick in different places. So the answer to the question is that we're going to need, 7 or 8 broad areas of study in order to inform an overall judgment which finance ministers and others are going to have to make in a hurry. And the one that you put is just one of those. But the challenge is to do all this in real time. It would be lovely to be able to wait until we really understood so much of the bits and pieces. At the moment, I think we have to set out the bits and pieces, and all the bits and pieces that were set out today by Kim and John, myself, were big bits and pieces. But then I think, going to have to pursue those, sometimes in partial equilibrium ways. A city story would be, of course, the equilibrium of the city, but not necessarily in the whole economy. And then we're going to have to make some judgments how we put it all together. I mean, that's the gardener's craft of being a a finance minister, and one single model is not going to do it for us.
We'll take one more question. Marginal utility of coffee is going up. Ted Truman.
Thank you. It's a bit, I maybe measure my ignorance on this topic, but I really found this very interesting, all the presentations. I came to think that maybe you're talking about systemic change, and I was forced to think about that we're actually in a multiple equilibrium situation, right? Because you're going through systemic change if you don't do anything, right? And you're describing a systemic change if you do something. So I wonder whether that's a useful way to think about this whole process, because we're going to be driven to one or the other types of equilibrium, if you want to call it equilibrium, over the future. Thank you very much.
Who wants to take it? Do you want to take it? Anybody?
Stopped.
Yeah. I think it's, I'm struck by the fact that we don't know enough on the economics of climate change. I mean, the situation is one in which we don't have a clear view on, you know, how much investment it would take, especially for the US. I mean, I asked the question, how much investment does the US need to do to get to net zero? And basically, there is no answer to that question because there is no target of reaching net zero. And I think that's more generally the issue of, you know, why is the cost of capital so high for developing countries? Why is I mean, how fast things can change? I think these. I'm struck by the, you know, the fact that research has been lagging behind considerably in this field, for reasons probably not have to do with the fact that there was no policy action, but now there is policy action, there is policy intention, and I think it's really time for research to catch up.
But Ted's point must be right. I mean, if the UK had surrendered in 1940 and there'd been an invasion, that would have been systems change, you know, and the UK didn't, and that was also systems change. One way or the other, it's going to happen. The question is, are we going to do it in as constructive way as possible, or do very little and get washed over by, if that's the right word, by climate change? On the numbers, Jean, I think not far off the number you used, 2% of GDP for richer countries and 3-4% for poorer countries is roughly the ballpark at the moment. I don't think we have to nail it down that precisely. The challenge is to get on with it, and we're going to learn a lot along the way. Chemin faisant, as they say.
Yeah.
Good. On this note, let me thank the speakers and let you go and get coffee. Thank you.